All right, well, welcome to Cinema Rabbit Trails, episode 7.
7, yes.
We just watched Darkest Hour, the new film about Winston Churchill, starring Gary Oldman. Thought it was really, really good.
Yeah,
it was
very good.
Special guest, introduce yourself.
My name is Glenn. I am their
Hi, Glenn.
I am their guest, and I don't know. Should I tell them who I am or what I do?
Just
or?
give a quick synopsis of who you are.
30 seconds. Go.
I train leaders. I'm a missionary. I'm getting ready to go to Germany, so it's kind of cool
Deutschland.
to watch a film about England in World War II because
That's a great setup to go to Germany.
it's actually a big issue. It's a big issue over there. They're not allowed to.
Oh yeah.
They have laws that don't let them talk about anything that supports the Nazis in any way. So
Wow. Can't say I blame them.
I got to go to Germany back in 2015. So I mean, it really was funny how here in America you might call someone a Nazi.
Yeah.
And it's a joke, but there it is
Yeah.
very serious.
Oh, yeah.
And understandably so. But it was just culturally, it just was funny how you're just like I just was like, I'm very careful about what I'm saying here. So yeah, absolutely. So
yeah.
that's really cool.
Adam, you haven't done a synopsis before, I don't think, on our live video. So why don't you give a synopsis of the film?
Okay, sure. So the context, it began, and I forgot what invasion. It talked about Belgium, correct?
Yeah.
What did it? That's my only question. Is what
Well, they at that time, I think it was mainly Belgium and France that were at the forefront of the German attack, and so those are the two main countries at major risk of about to be overrun, and pretty much it had been determined that they were going to be overrun. They didn't have a fighting chance.
That's right. And then, so after this, then we're dealt with the decision for a new prime minister, because the previous prime minister is seen as inadequate, as the one who cannot face the trials, or their current state of invasion. So they decide to choose a new prime minister, and a few come up in discussion.
Chamberlain being one of, was it Chamberlain?
Chamberlain was the one stepping down.
He was the one stepping down.
Yes.
Halifax was in the running. And it's interesting because, as we'll talk about later on, you do see an interesting dynamic between him and Churchill and their views on peace and war.
Yeah.
So he was in the running for it, but ultimately they, long story short, chose Churchill. And so during the length of this film, really, we focus on the events of mainly Dunkirk, I would say, and the way in which they were trying to pull out the troops, which was almost the entire British Army.
Yeah, what was it?
300,000.
300,000 troops.
Jeez.
So if you've seen Dunkirk, you are familiar, I think, with the context of it, the historical context of it. So that's a good film to, I would say, preface this film with.
Really lays in the foundation of how serious it was. It gives you the exact picture of, like, this is the desperation we're actually feeling at the moment.
It is, yeah.
So.
And we go a little more into Churchill's character, and we'll go on to talk about that. But that seems to be a good gist.
Because it seemed like the film was really, Dunkirk was almost like the focal point of, do we surrender or do we continue to fight? And that was kind of the big decision that Dunkirk kind of set up. So absolutely,
Yes.
Good job.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think my favorite quote from the film was, "You don't parlay with a tiger when your head is in its mouth."
Absolutely.
Oh
Yes.
man, I love that quote so much.
Because the thing about Churchill, and unfortunately the film didn't convey it as well as I feel like it should have. Churchill was a voracious reader. He was constantly reading. Like, it showed the scene of him with a newspaper. I remember going through a college lecture by Rufus Fears from like the Great Course series, talking about Churchill and how he would read like 5 newspapers every single morning, and just how he would be constantly reading, history, biographies, and so he was very well read with military tactics, and so definitely something like that he knew enough. Where like, how many more dictators do we have to woo or appease?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny to me because you have so many people in the film, and you can relate it to today too, in some ways, obviously not the war aspect, but just politicians acting like politicians. And Winston Churchill, that falls in line with that, because Winston Churchill, if he read so much, he knew modern news from multiple sources, which is something we don't see today. Many people just rely on one news source.
Yeah.
or maybe one or two at max. And then you have,
if any at all.
if any at all. Facebook does not count, everybody.
does not.
It doesn't,
Facebook and
no.
Instagram do not count as news sources.
My sister's brother said.
Yeah, Snapchat doesn't count either.
might
I've seen
count-
they've
it might
tried
be-
to get on the news
It
feed.
might be called a news feed, but it's not.
It's not news.
I just use
That's
Reddit, guys.
Oh
That's
boy.
the opinion.
Oh, the news
opinion feed.
underground.
The underground news.
But yeah, so I mean, he knew history and everything. And, go to the classic quote: "Those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it." I think that's why Churchill stands out, because he's obviously for one reason, because he was a man put in a leadership position at one of the most darkest times in history, at least of modern history. But the fact that he knew all that and navigated it differently than all the other politicians around him wanted to, he didn't. When it came down to it, he didn't act like a politician, even though he was a lifelong politician, which is interesting to me. We have, again, I'm only going to relate it to modern news right now, but we have Trump right now, who isn't a career politician. He is doing things differently. Not going to say whether I agree with it or not, but you go back to Churchill now. I mean, he was a lifelong politician, but he knew history. It doesn't take a non-politician to act differently. It just, I mean, if you know history and really just read a lot, if you read from every source possible.
There's a lot of things about Churchill that you kind of have to read who he is, just like how he read biographies about different leaders. You'd kind of have to read his biography to know kind of why he's like that.
Many biographies.
Yeah, it's because he was marked by failure. He failed a whole lot.
Reminds me of Abraham Lincoln.
Well, military experience.
Yeah, and not just that, but he also failed as a politician quite a bit too. So this is what I really loved about when they set up the dynamic between him and his party. It's like he was the last thought. He was like the afterthought.
Yeah.
And he ended up being just what they needed. So it's really remarkable. I really love how the film, they didn't water that aspect of it down. They actually portrayed, a little bit more of who he was.
Yeah, and I didn't really know that going into the film. I always thought Churchill was just he just happened to be the prime minister at the time. I didn't know it was like in this darkest hour that he just came into play.
Mm-hmm.
A very side choice.
One thing that's also interesting about Churchill, I didn't know this, but after the war was over, I'm not sure how England's government system works, but they didn't keep him as prime minister. When the war was over, he was out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, how can they do this, this national war hero? And it's because Churchill was saying, hey, now that Germany's done, we have to turn our face to communist Russia now. And what was interesting about the movie is they really started tapping in how Churchill was... He started tapping into the voice of the people, and he saw people's attitude was never surrender.
Yeah.
And I think probably as the war was ending, he's like, hey, we have to now take on the Russians and communism. The English people were like, we're done, we can't go on. And so I think they were just weary of Churchill.
Yeah.
But that
You
was
can't blame him at that point, though.
He wasn't the only one.
Oh yeah.
He wasn't the only one. I think before. Was it Roosevelt?
Yes.
Sorry, my mind's I think even he was actually pushing a little bit for Russia too, but I guess everybody was just tired of fighting.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and it's kind of hard to convince people of that when you've also been in partnership with them to defeat your biggest enemy.
Yeah.
So that probably would have been a hard sell on the American people. But that's one thing I found interesting as well. You mentioned just Churchill being in touch with the people and everything, because in the Parliament system with the UK, the people didn't feel like they really had a huge voice. And so that was a huge moment. I mean, obviously it was a huge moment in the film, but just in general, that's a very big moment to speak of. Just the fact that the highest power in the UK at that time got on a train and spoke to the actual citizens. Just how do you guys feel about this? It's help me out here. You can just see he's really desperate at the moment. He's good at not showing it, but they kind of give that good balance. Gary Oldman was amazing at showing all the dynamics of the character, but you could see he was he's desperate for information at the moment, but he still comes across as in control and in lead, which is very hard balance to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just receiving that input from the people, and that's one thing.
His wit too. I loved his wit on the train because he was very witty.
Yeah. It's funny to me, too, because he's he didn't have as much of a habit of it as Abe Lincoln did, but you can relate the characters very well, even in their history, failure upon failure upon failure, coming in randomly at the very last second, the right moment in time, just like God very nicely orchestrating everything.
And it's funny how God, like historically, when you look at the figures that God uses, that's usually the kind of background they have. They're like King David, for instance.
Yeah.
His father didn't even come look for him. When they came to anoint the king, he was out in the field tending the sheep. Everybody thought he was like, the lowest of the low.
Heck, even go over to, if you want to pull in the extremes, you can go to the disciples and, fishermen, tax collectors, and the extreme of all extremes, in my opinion, would be Saul/Paul.
Yeah.
He was Hitler to a lot of to the Christians at the time.
Yeah.
He was their Hitler. And he turns him into one of the most famous disciples of all time. So it's very crazy and very cool.
It's like God's constantly turning everything on its head. Because societally, Saul would have been one of the elites of the religious class of that day.
Yeah.
Right.
But to the rest of to the church, to his church, he would have been a Hitler-esque sort of figure because he was persecuting people, having them beaten, stoned to death, like Stephen was stoned to death at the approval of the Apostle Paul or Saul.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, the first 12 disciples, they were actually the rejects of that society.
Yeah.
So he started off with the rejects of that society, then he went to the terrorizer of the church that God had just established. So it's crazy how God is constantly, flipping things on its head.
So God invented the story of the underdog. There you go. Gotta love it. So it was funny. I was talking to somebody. It was months ago. It was a Facebook conversation. It wasn't a Facebook argument. It was actually probably the only civil discussion I've ever had on Facebook ever, and it was awesome. This dude was and we made sure other people tried to hop in and make it an argument. It was just like, go away. It was great. Two opposing arguments were both telling the argumentative person go away. But it was great. But one thing we were talking about is morality. And I only mention this briefly because it doesn't fully relate to the film, but
That's rabbit trails.
Right, it's a rabbit trail. So, but we were talking about it, and I'm coming from a Christian perspective where God sets the moral standard. He's coming from at least as far as I understand it, more atheistic perspective. I don't know if it was fully atheistic. I'm not 100% sure, but basically more evolutionary standard. We'll put it that way. So that basically, I straight up asked him. So you're saying that the most major authority, the person with the most power, or the group with the most power across the globe, sets the moral standard. So moral standard is flexible based upon who's in power. And he was like, yes, all right. So one step further relating to history, if Hitler had won and controlled all, if not at least most, of the known world, he would set the moral standard, and his slaughter of the Jews would have been morally correct because he sets the standard. He's like, it wouldn't have. It's definitely not okay in my personal moral standard, but evolutionary speaking, yes, he would be correct. And it's just not that that makes that person a bad person. The guy I was talking to a bad person. I'm not going to name him, obviously, but protect his privacy. But he obviously, he's not as in support of all this.
He's operating from.
Right. That's what
evolution
evolution standards would make that correct. So the question is, are you okay with that? Which I'm not saying are you okay with slaughtering millions of people. Obviously, most people would not be okay with that. But it's just interesting to me how there's
I would have been
no moral
curious to
standard
ask
without
though,
God.
because that's he says from an evolutionary standpoint. Then yes, personally no.
Yeah.
I'm curious though because personally, you're arguing that evolutionary is the standard. So what do you?
Why do you have a problem
if you're
with that?
personally against it?
Exactly.
Well, it just goes to show you that evolution isn't the way to go. That's not the way that we. We can think about it logically, and even by our own sensibilities, and we know that it's nonsense. It doesn't make sense to order your life around survival of the fittest, because that's not.
We're Darwinian evolution.
Yeah.
That's just not. That's just not how we operate. It's not how we work.
I need to have a science debate on this because it's funny to me because I've debated with people who are, at least I've not debated with an evolution scientist. I have not gotten to that level, but I have argued with people who know a lot of the science of evolution. And it's so funny to me because we both kind of end up coming down to the same conclusion, because what it breaks down to, every single evolution science proof whether it's carbon dating or certain fossils discovered, things like that, they can fall within the creationist view of science as well. It all depends on the perspective you start from. But it all comes down to, at the very end of it, just like, because the Big Bang that is the biggest problem. You're basically saying, in a Big Bang theory, is the universe created itself, and in some way, shape, or form, all matter has existed in some way, shape, or form for all of time with no beginning. So in the end, it comes down to, do you believe that matter in every way, shape, and form has existed for all of time? We're talking about multiple types of things existing. Or do you believe in one sovereign God who loves you, who decided to create you for a purpose, who has existed throughout all of time and never has had a beginning, never will have an end? Same like matter. What's easier to believe?
Yeah.
Well, they call us ludicrous, and yet they believe in an eternal state of things.
Yeah.
And we believe in an eternal God. So it's definitely wouldn't make sense in that context. Of, if you're suggesting that believing in an eternal being is absurd, then why do you suggest there's eternal elements that make up all things?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the discussion falls on a wide spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And, today we don't really think about that information. Actually, most people throughout time don't think about that information to the degree it needs to be thought about.
True.
Before coming to an actual conclusion.
Yeah.
But even within evolution, right? Because we started off with Darwinian evolution, but then the scientists who were examining it were like, well, the data that we have now doesn't fit with that. It doesn't make any sense. So what did they do? They came up with neo-Darwinianism, right? And just 2 years ago, with the new information they have, they look at neo-Darwinianism, and they say, well, the information that we have, the actual evidence, not proof, right? Because proof only exists in mathematics and logic, but science is dealt with evidence and the interpretation of that evidence. Well, when they look at the actual data, they go, well, neo-Darwinianism doesn't work either. And so there was
neo-Darwinism. Is that?
So they literally came up, and for the third time, maybe even the fourth time, they said, well, the evolutionary narrative that we've been presenting, it doesn't work with the data. The data actually disproves the narrative. The problem is that information typically doesn't get out to the general populace very quickly.
Of course, it destroys a worldview.
And it's more of a worldview than it is a scientific position. Yeah. Because if it's real science, then any pushback against it should not be met with the same kind of vitriol that a worldview inculcated as a religion, the medieval empire under Christianity, for instance.
Yeah.
So,
well, and it's funny. It's like people talk about, science proves evolution, and yes, I mean, science changes, perspectives change, all this stuff, and but we go back to the weatherman. You can't predict tomorrow's weather perfectly accurately, or the entire weeks, much less. I mean, the years to come. I mean, you can the whole global warming, climate change debate too. But really, it comes down to, all right, if I'm being honest, I'm not going to trust a human until a human's perspective on whether and where the world is going until you can create the weather, until you control where the weather's going and what's happening. I can't trust what your predictions are going to be and let you tell me what my worldview should be based upon your science. I mean, that's my perspective.
On this note and the film's note.
There you go.
Bring it back, Adam. There you go.
Beginning of the world, World War II, Churchill.
All right, go.
Yes, that's right. I think we can consider talking about communication, because you saw the criticalness of communicating well.
Yeah.
And how that either led to camaraderie or it led to disunity. And so it's really important that we take note of, okay, what are we communicating? How are we communicating it? And even why are we communicating it? That especially is one to consider when we're in a world that supports a no filter response. So what do you guys think about that? What do you guys think about communication and its importance? and even the way
Yeah.
it was seen in the film.
Good question. I was like, I have a thought. I'm trying to find out.
Okay.
Definitely go
Well, let
for
me
it.
start with mine.
Go for it.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. Words are powerful. One of the things that's different, though, is that back then, the people who had the medium to communicate in that range was fairly limited.
Mhm.
And so, you know, you had he had such a great command of the English language. Remember what he said? What Halifax said? He took the English language and mobilized it,
into
Yeah.
battle,
and then
Yeah.
sent it to war.
right. Yes.
Oh,
I mean,
that was
that's
good,
that's
man.
how powerful it was. But now we live in a time, like, look at what we're doing here. We live in a time where almost everybody has access to that medium, and we have a wide audience, and so to some degree, it actually diminishes its effect.
Yeah.
It's like an overload of
Yeah.
communication,
Yeah.
and it's just
And
becoming
so-
noise.
But what ends up happening, and I think that we can see this with the whole fake news and the whole, you know, Facebook and all the stuff that's happened with our media, is that the loudest and most obnoxious, not necessarily most factual, ends up getting the final word, and people
Mm.
end up getting behind that.
I have a great quote. I want to say it was Shakespeare who said it, but I'm not 100% sure if I'm right on that. I think it was. The empty vessel screams the loudest.
Mm.
I think that was Shakespeare who said that. But you think about all these protests, all the fake news, all the people I hear scream the loudest are the people who are upset with the politics, who get angry at faith and certain and the very conservative work ethic and things like that. It's or conservative viewpoint. They just scream so loud. And you see them all over the news, and people on the news yelling about it and creating these hoaxes, trying to debunk certain things, or get people change everyone's views on other people. It's just like, you guys are yelling at a brick wall. you're creating this mental box for yourself that's just echoing, and the only people hearing it are yourselves. You're just screaming inside your own metal box, and it's just echoing back to you.
And to be fair, I think both sides can be guilty of.
Oh, very, very true.
yeah.
I don't mean to. Yeah, I shouldn't have singled out just one group, but
Yeah.
you're right.
No.
It's both sides are very guilty of that.
And sorry, did you
No,
want to?
go ahead.
Yeah, we're both fair. What I was gonna say though is, I think the reason why that is we're a culture that has refused to listen to people. Like
Mhm.
we,
That's why we're doing this.
yeah. Well, I'm going through How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie.
Love that book.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a
But
good
he
book.
talks about the art of listening and how it's not just, I can listen to you. That's not really listening.
Yeah.
He's talking about listening as almost this full-on engagement of, I am hearing what you're saying, I am asking questions to clarify that. It's an art.
Yeah.
And it is something we have not even begun to do well in our society, because
Yeah.
we are so engrossed in our phones and more honestly our own opinions. So I think that's why we have all these shouting matches, is we don't, first of all, we care more about our opinions than hearing what the other person has to say, but plus we're more concerned about being heard, not so much being understood. So therefore, I'm trying to tell you what's right, what's wrong. You're trying to tell me what's right and what's wrong. So
Yeah.
I'm not interested in learning from you, a conversation. I'm interested in winning.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at right now.
We're
Is
very much
we
at
need
that.
to, and that's what's going to be hard, is both sides, everybody has to take a step back and be like, okay, let's open up a dialogue. And this is why we're not having progress in government. This is
Yeah.
why we're not
Agreed.
having progress
Absolutely.
with political, other parties, is because we're having shouting matches. And you're right,
Yeah.
people aren't listening. It is a brick wall.
Two things I want to mention real quick. One, a quote from Doctor Who.
We're
That
just on roll with quotes.
I know I am. They're all coming to mind. This is
I
great.
need to catch up.
Yeah, this is usually the other thing, David. But it was a clip I actually showed Adam, David. I showed you guys, but a clip from Doctor Who, where from the newest guy, but Peter Capaldi, but where they basically have alien and human race at the table on these buttons that will either destroy
This
both
is
or one party.
too, by the way, just letting you
This
know.
yeah, this is right. This is the same time. here.
Aliens, totally.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
But no, like one thing he says, it's a long speech, but he gets down to the point. It's like, how long? Like you guys are on the brink of war, and you're gonna keep killing each other until you both get to the point where you have to do something you should have just done in the first place: sit down and talk. Just like that's the whole thing. I mean, it's
The
different.
history repeating itself.
History repeating itself. Now, it was different with Hitler because he was just an animal going after everything he possibly could until he had no other choice but to kill himself. I mean, he ended up killing himself because he had nowhere else to go. He wasn't willing to negotiate. That's a different animal. But if it's two factions with any semblance of civility, that's what it comes down to. Just sit down and talk. I mean, how many people do you have to send out to die and kill each other until it just gets to the point where there's enough blood to force a conversation? Mm-hmm. It's a pride issue for one thing. And I know there are a lot of other factors that can come into play. I'm not saying that's the only solution that's available. I'm saying that's not what should always be done. There are instances where the only solution is to fight back. Mm-hmm.
There's some people who only strength is the only language they understand.
Yeah,
so.
It's true.
Because what you're assuming, and this is what Churchill was arguing, was you can't reason with a tiger while your head's in its mouth. He's saying Hitler is not a reasonable man. This is not normal men don't go after world domination here. Because what Hitler was going after was, in a sense, it was admirable, where his nation was in shambles. They were playing for World War I. They were in absolute debt. They had no military.
Yeah.
So he was giving some pride back to his nation, which any leader wants to, lead his country well, lead his people well.
Yeah.
His ambitions just outgrew that far too much, and his ego drove that. So the point is, like, you can't negotiate with somebody like that, because what you want, like what he wants, is not something you can possibly give.
Yeah.
Well, what Churchill was faced with, and what he ultimately decided, was you have Hitler, who is ruthlessly conquering, and where are those who are going to ruthlessly defend? Yeah. And that was his point. And also with Parliament, the point I was going to make earlier too is he was in a place, a political atmosphere that was very
hostile,
focused, not just hostile, but they were focused on being dignified. And in that environment, you can imagine the amount of pushback you would have with that unbridled spirit that he had. And so there's a little break in communication there. Yeah. In that regard too, so something else to consider.
I always laugh at this. Not laugh. I shouldn't say laugh, but am amused. I'm quite amused by things in like you see it in movies and in history books about like early American War and the Civil War and things like that. Polite warfare, where it was literally lines of armies taking turns shooting each other, and it's just like, your turn. Okay, we lost that many men. Our turn. And it's just like, what is this? Like, how does this work? That doesn't make sense.
That doesn't make
sense. And I mean, in that type of warfare, it literally just comes down to who has the most men.
And the most accurate men.
Yeah, well, most accurate men. I mean, again,
no, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you wound someone, they're out of the war for at least a while, so it counts as a military casualty.
I mean, this is just a thought. I have to wonder where that even comes from, because you had, medieval warfare, swords, that kind of weapons, which is definitely not. It's very personal, because you're not just killing somebody, you're in their face killing them. So I can imagine perhaps there were maybe some good intentions with that. I don't know. I'll look that up. I'm curious.
Well, it's all a part of, and this would be a huge rabbit trail if we went on it, but it's all a part of. It was all a part of the. What was that age called?
The Dark Ages?
No, not the Dark Ages. It's
not chivalry, is it?
No, not chivalry. When they started to develop rifling, gunpowders, and
Industrial Revolution. I mean,
no,
that's not. That's way later.
You mean like Minutemen and people like that?
Yeah, like wars and the way they did warfare. I can't remember exactly.
I forget what the period is called. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, like it's escaping my mind for some reason, but. It had to do with that the transition between the nature of warfare and the nature of the cultures that was conducting the warfare. And so the culture wasn't keeping up with the technology, basically. And so when the Americans started to fight like the
guerrilla warfare,
the Native Americans, it changed the way that warfare was conducted.
Yeah. So. It's funny. Again, this is a rabbit trail, real quick, but just in relation to history and just how one man can change the entire course of history, very similar to how Churchill did it. It was with Churchill, it was one man standing against or mobilizing a nation to be the last man standing, which allowed us to eventually enter the war. I know, it would have been a much more desperate situation if Britain had fallen or surrendered or come to terms with Germany. and then we get attacked on Pearl Harbor, and we're the only ones left to even fight back. That would have
Yeah.
been a much worse case scenario. But in relation to that, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but they did a movie about him called Amazing Grace. But
William
Wil-
Wilberforce.
Wil-
William
Wilberforce,
Wilberforce,
yeah.
yes. So he,
Good story.
yes, a Christian man who changed, who he began the process in the UK of eliminating slavery. And what's funny is people don't realize how that changed the Civil War. We would very likely still have slavery today, or at least it would be a very different history as far as in regards to slavery with the
Yeah.
U.S. if it hadn't been for that one Christian man changing Britain about that, because his timing on that was very instrumental. Civil War was when Wilberforce was late 1700s.
Civil War was in 1861. So the abolition of the slave trade, I think, was in 18.
It was very close.
It was about like
It was a couple decades.
Yeah.
So
it was very close.
yeah, and the South was actually in our Civil War was petitioning to the UK to actually enter the U.S. Civil War to help them out.
1807.
Okay, so
61.
60 years, about 60 years difference, and yeah, if it hadn't been for William Wilberforce, the UK would have had reason to join the South and
Yeah.
fight the North, which very likely would have made us lose the war, or made the North lose the war. Therefore, keeping slavery alive in two major nations.
Yeah.
But it all came down to one guy who was just like, "This is wrong. Let's change this."
Yeah. It's about it's the power of worldview.
Yeah.
Right. What changes a name? What would cause someone to go and fight against something that's tyrannical?
Yeah.
It's not just a feeling, but there's actually worldviews behind it. Like what you believe actually matters.
That's why evolution is so dangerous, because it eliminates any sort of
Conviction.
conviction and worldview. Brings me to the Avengers. It's like, you know why you're going to lose? Because you lack conviction.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's not evolution by itself, but it's
True.
a world devoid of a moral standard that stands above just human beings. Because if every man is the measure of
All things.
if man is the measure of all things, then you have to ask yourself, well, which man? You know, and you posited earlier, like,
Which man?
is it Hitler or is it Gandhi? Is it Mother Teresa or is it, you know, who is the standard for morality? So.
But kind of to your point about, because I could really go on a lot of rabbit trails off of that story. Two things kind of tying it back into the movie is what kind of you're talking about it, but talking about worldview, but character. So Wilberforce took him 20 years to abolish the slave trade because he'd brought up in Parliament and they shot him down. And so first of all, there's just this dedication to perseverance. But he also had, he was by himself in Parliament, but he also had, I forget what the Clapham circle. But anyway, he had a group of friends that he was with, and so is this group of friends, and they all had their sphere of influence. With you had Granville Sharp, who was in politics. You had a woman who was in entertainment, and so they were all dedicated Christians, taking their worldview into their sphere of influences. And so it was amazing how, and Wilberforce said he had two convictions that God had placed on his life, and it really was the rest of his life was, one, abolishing the slave trade, and two, he called it the Reformation of Manners, which is basically the morals of society, because England was terrible. You had animals fighting outside, bloods running in the street. There was no sewage system. Kids were being forced to work in dangerous conditions. And so it was that conviction that transformed England and, of course, affected the rest of history. But I think of Churchill, and I have a quote. One thing that I think was amazing about Churchill is, in the movie, he gives a speech, and he says how it wasn't true. And he says, I've been trying to be honest all these speeches until this one. And you can see how he's so distraught over that. But a quote that I have is, someone was asking him about, I think it was I forget what, there was this like a huge, you talked about all the failures that he has. But one of them was, they were saying like, hey, we can blame so-and-so for this failure or this political thing. And Churchill says, quote, how easy it would be for me to simply put somebody else between myself and these problems and let them take the blow. But I will never take that cowardly route. Let the blows come hard again and again, for I know what I do is right. And so kind of comes back to that conviction that someone is willing to die for their convictions, saying, "I know
Yeah.
what this is right."
Yeah.
And I feel like today we're needing some leaders who don't just say the right things. We need people who fight for what they believe in.
Yeah.
Who stand on moral
They
principles.
don't mind
moral
going down
character.
for it.
Oh yeah, and they find the glory in that, because it's like, if I go down, I'm going down as a martyr because I know this is right.
Yeah.
Well, don't just ask the leader, ask what spirit he holds.
Yeah.
Because if you find that out, you have more of an answer to cling to.
Spirit, like,
For example,
on that.
like in a historical context, you can think of those who have come before, great men and women that we have seen through the centuries, and we can look to them. In fact, we're reminded constantly, don't just look at those who inspire you, but also look at those who inspired the ones you're inspired by.
Mhm.
And even before that, far back as even ancient Greece to
Yeah.
Aristotle, and take note of what they learned, what wisdom they gained, because wisdom will cover all the ages. It's not simply
that's a good quote.
included within each cultural, whatever culture comes and
Yeah,
goes.
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's funny, even Aristotle was abused by his own culture. They hated him and a lot of people, throughout his entire life, some people still hated him, but
That's right. So the point with that is that their philosophies or what their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Look to that first. Try and understand why do
Absolutely.
they hold.
Yeah.
What meaning do those foundations?
Yeah.
So one thing that you learn about Winston Churchill when you read about who he is that he was a good friend of the Jews, and he had strong Christian convictions from God about the things of God, and the fact that Jews were being persecuted in this way. That was actually something that galvanized him to want to fight the tyranny of Hitler, because you don't always know this, but a lot of the world didn't know exactly what was going on in the war camps.
Not even most
yeah,
of Germany didn't
most
know.
people didn't know
Yeah.
until much later.
Yeah,
Like after the war was over, they didn't know.
after the war, and in fact, there's still people today who will look at that and they will say, "No, that didn't happen." There's still people who are, death camp deniers, if you will, and just
We still have
because.
flat earthers too, so
Yeah.
As if they
there'll
hold
always be some
authority.
people.
So, but there was a conviction. Like there's many figures during this time period who were burdened so deeply by the things that were happening. Like they couldn't sleep. It was so bad because they knew that injustice was taking place and they had to do something about it.
Wow. Yeah, it's rare quality to see nowadays.
We like pretend, but
Oh,
I don't
yeah,
think
we
a
love
real
pretending, yeah.
conviction actually sits there. I don't think that a real conviction for something could really sit on you and weigh on you like something like that, unless there's something bigger than you that's doing it.
Yes.
Because if you're only doing, because most people are only doing it out of I believe out of a sense of selfishness. Like this is for me, this is what I want. But when a conviction comes on you where there's actually something bigger than you, and you know that that's the thing that's defining right and wrong, and there's real injustice taking place, I think that's where a real burden will hit somebody and say, this has to be done. And that's how I feel about sharing the gospel, for instance, because I look at my life and I look at the vision of the kingdom that God seeks to bring and how it's impacted and changed my life and how much it's changed the lives of hundreds of people that I've seen come to Christ, how they're literally living a way that's destroying themselves and maybe hurting other people as well, and they're completely transformed by the gospel, right? And when Jesus died on the cross, right? You can imagine that he must have been he was so stressed before it happened, he was sweating blood, and yet he was deeply convicted, right? When he was in the garden, he's like, if there's any other way, let it be that way, but not my will be done, your will be done.
Yeah.
And I think that he was looking at you and I through the ages and saying, look, if I don't do this thing, then the redemption of humanity will be gone. The redemption of not just humanity but creation as a whole, it won't it won't proceed as it's supposed to proceed. So,
Yeah.
so I really think that enacting justice on the earth is the big driver to really see change in the world.
Mm-hmm.
When you
Yeah.
see something not working not functioning as it's supposed to function, you go, I may not be able to change all the other things, but this one thing, I want to change this one thing, and I'll give my life for it. And
I kind of want to ask you this question. Definitely want to get y'all's opinion. So let's kind of see how we can kind of put this practically. Like, how do we culminate that conviction? And, Glenn, why don't you...
Can you explain a little bit more? What do you mean?
Well, like, it's very easy for us to talk about things but never do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I even feel convicted sometimes just talking about this stuff. It's like, wow, this is good information, but what are we actually going to do? So, kind of for those, just us, but also those who are listening, talking about like, how do we formulate this conviction where it's like, this is what I'm going to be about. This is how I'm going to start going down that road. Because what you're talking about is, it's kind of a worldview shift, but it's a paradigm shift. It's like, okay, this is not just about me getting what I want, getting as much stuff, money, accolades as I want, but it's about what am I going to be about? What will my legacy be? Because Billy Graham just, passed away a few days ago. Yeah. And this is a man, we would have to look at his life and be like, wow, what an impact. And that's not just something you just wake up and think, I think I'll be a world changer today. It was his entire, a consistent lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's not just something you do on a whim. That's something that is...
There is for every person in the kingdom of God, everyone who calls himself a son of God, Christian, a corporate call to advance God's kingdom, right? Part of the problem is that our worldview has been hijacked. We don't know what the Bible's actually calling us to. We get a nebulous salvation story, but nothing about what the actual mission is. Because Jesus didn't save us just to save you. He saved us for a mission. He saved us for a purpose. God's plan through this was to empower God's people to bring God's kingdom on the earth. And God's kingdom on the earth isn't a physical space, but it's every person who looks to God and says, I want to reflect his image. So all Christians have that call in general, which means that you got to know what the mission is, and you've got to know who God is, right? When you know those two things, the other stuff starts to fall into place, because each one of us also has a personal call. You remember when God gave the parable of the talents? He said, some servants I gave 3 talents, some I gave 2, and one I gave 1, and he went down the list of how they responded. Well, that's like everybody's individual call. You've all been allotted a measure of gifting, a measure of influence, and all of that is never for just you, right? You remember the unrighteous servant's response? He said, I knew that you're an unjust master, so I buried my talent. And then he dug it up and gave it back to him. He says, because you reap where you haven't sown. And the thing that's really atrocious about that story, because when I read the Bible, I tend to try to see how God maybe feels about these things. Like, you imagine for a second you're God, and you don't really need anything, you don't really want anything. Why is he giving these people talents? Is it for something selfish? No, not at all. He's actually doing it for their sake. He's given them talents for their sake. And out of his own goodness, right? God didn't save us because we were good. He saved us because he's good. He didn't save us because we were righteous. He saved us because he's righteous. He didn't save us because we were loving, but it's because he's loving, right? So he gives us these talents, and it's never just for us. But it is for us at the same time. So he gives us these gifts, these abilities, and it's to bless us, but it's also to bless everyone around us, right? Yeah. When you look at the covenant given to Abraham, and I'll kind of pause here and kind of give the imperative. Embedded in God's covenant was a promise that through us the nations would be blessed, that through Abraham the nations would be blessed. We were always God always intended to bring all of the people of the earth into his covenant, right? We're the fruit of that, because we're not the Jews, we're the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And now we're grafted in and we know God. Now, the imperative is this: if you then know who God is and you know what the mission is, then you must do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're responsible. He says, everybody, when they stand before God, they're not going to be judged based on some hidden inward response. They're going to be judged by their deeds. That's still true even in the new covenant. Yeah. Every person will be judged according to their deeds, whether for good or for bad.
Well, and the great thing is that, because I've had that conversation with some people about obedience and other religions. I think we've touched on it in past podcast episodes too. But the great thing is that it's just like in a relationship or marriage or friendship. If you love the other person or there's a mutual love there, you do things for other people. It's a natural response, and so when you love God, it's a natural response to follow His law. And it's not even a matter of following the law; it's a matter of going above and beyond and going after what He calls you to do. And it's a desire to do that. It's not a do this or you're out. Yeah, that's religion.
You're
this
compelled
is
to do it.
Right. Yeah, it's not being compelled to do it. It's he tells us laws of things we shouldn't do. He doesn't tell us what we are to do in the Bible. He sets ground rules for everybody in the fold, saying these are the things that you are not supposed to do. These are the things I'm going to lay on your heart that you are going to be convicted of guilt, and you're going to account for whenever you disobey me. You're going to feel that guilt, and you will be punished. That's just. You get punished when you do things wrong, but whenever you love me, it's very obvious I love you. I died for you. I sent my son, and he died for you. But when you love me back, this isn't going to be a problem. You're going to naturally want to follow my law. You're going to naturally want to fulfill what I call you to do. And you're going to be more fulfilled than you could possibly imagine. You're going to experience joy beyond what you could possibly imagine. Yeah. The peace that passes all understanding. It's amazing how much whenever you love someone, and especially someone as as amazing as the Lord and Savior that we serve, it's just amazing the response what He gives us in return.
Yeah, I mean I'm an extreme example. I come from an extreme kind of circumstance from how God sort of rescued me. But I really believe that it's actually supposed to be the norm, right? When the Bible says that He laid down His life for all, so that those who live would no longer live for themselves, but live for the one who laid His life down for them, I think of it as all of my life actually belongs to God now. And it is birthed out of a deep love. Like, the love that he says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says it's the love of Christ. It compels us to urge men, be reconciled to God, right? It's His love, and it's compelling. Like, you have to do it. You don't have a choice in the matter. It's like a fire in your bones. Mm-hmm. And so we have settled here in the West, actually I think in many places, for this sort of cuddly view of Christianity that's unwilling to confront evil, that's unwilling to confront our sense of comfort, that we think that, if I live life peaceably and I get to die in peace and I don't have to make any real sacrifices, that's real Christianity to me. But that's not real Christianity. That is a dead, worthless piece of garbage. When you look at the figures throughout the Bible who were called by God, every single one of them suffered tremendously. And I'm not saying go look for suffering, or that
it'll find you,
or that calling, some kind of calling you have entails suffering. But for a lot of people who are called, you are going to experience varying degrees of suffering. In the more that you come and push against the established order, the more you're going to suffer. Yeah. Right? Jesus did the hard work. He came and established the kingdom. And he's pushing back the kingdom of darkness. But there's still a kingdom of darkness to push back.
Yeah. Well, and it's like there's what I was reading last week. I think Egypt right now actually has some of the harshest persecution of Christians specifically right now. I mean, they're actually being killed by the hundreds and the thousands at the moment right now in Egypt, which is currently it's in turmoil. But I mean, I think you're right, especially down here in the Bible Belt in Tennessee. I'm from Arkansas. I think it's even worse in Arkansas because it's everyone around you, at least most people around you, have a respect for Christianity. Here, it's more of a college town. I think there's still a general respect. It's still part of the Bible Belt. There's a lot of churches, but there's still a mix between people who don't respect Christianity. But we're just so in a bubble. We're just in a very, very nice, cuddly little bubble, and we're just so clueless to what other Christians and fellow believers are going through, and that still exists.
And that's why I bring up the question, just because, like, if we are Christians and just people in general, just having convictions about things, like, there's things in my life that I'm honestly like, that's not right. Something ought to be done about that. And like, life gets busy. Other things take priorities, paying the bills.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to make sacrifices. But as you were talking about, Glenn, how you will be put to the test. You will suffer. And I'm just thinking about, like, people like Churchill, Wilberforce, like, they paid a heavy price. Like, Wilberforce definitely paid a price with his health and definitely not being a popular figure among a lot of his peers. And John Newton, also his mentor, suffered a lot as well. And all the disciples were martyred except for John. Was it John? John, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, John. But I guess part of it is knowing identity. So definitely knowing who God is helps with that conviction. And knowing what you're going to be about and willing to pay it at any cost really helps determine that trajectory.
Something I've wondered more recently is, are all these superhero movies and like the war video games, are they actual substitutes for that conviction? I mean, not that not that it's a bad thing necessarily. I mean, you can argue
it's a
definitely
clue as to kind of what we want.
We love that conviction. We love the idea of
not the price.
Yes, we don't want the price, and
price.
It's funny to me how you'll think about. I think I had a pastor preach a sermon one time. And he asked something that was like threw me way off, and it got me thinking. We think about a glorious revolution, bloody battles, dying in a blaze of glory. It's like, yes, I'm willing to do that. Are you willing to lose your job for your faith? Brings it down to reality. We love the glory and the flames and the mighty death at the hands of a fearsome enemy. Yeah. But it's like, are you willing to lose your job for your faith if it came down to it?
Mundane, yeah.
Yeah. Are you willing to lose your comfort? It's like, it's great going from comfort to battle, but are you willing to go from comfortable to very uncomfortable?
Yeah. I mean, Winston, you could see that he was terrified in the moment of that decision. And really, the words weren't coming to him, and so he couldn't string his words together. He was afraid, and expressed that plainly. So I think we could also learn from that. There is great fear, and we do have great fears all the time. And if you say you don't have fear, you're a fool.
Yeah,
or a liar.
You are fearful in some way.
And it's that fear that is what makes courage such an inspiring and admirable quality. Because like when he's giving that speech, you're just like. You're just wanting to and I think that's kind of what you're hitting on is we have that love for these action hero movies because it calls in us something. We're meant to be warriors in some capacity, and it's ingrained inside of us, and we love when other people are standing on their convictions. And I think that's also why we are so disgusted when we see traitors and see people who won't stand for anything, because it's like you were made for more than this. What you're doing is wrong. You're supposed to be. So I think that's why we love those movies. But you're right. They don't have that.
Makes me think of Dark Knight Rises. Like, fear is why you don't succeed. It's like, I'm not afraid. It's like, that's the problem.
Right. Because without fear, can it really be courage?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a video game where it's like, it's cool. Yeah. But there's no real price, and therefore it's not a real.
Why do you think World War II is the most romanticized? I mean, that's what half of our war video games focus on is World War II, maybe World War I some, but mainly World War II, because it was a very different enemy. It was a very clear enemy, and it was probably one of the most righteous wars the world has ever seen. It was definitely probably the most justified war ever. In pretty much all of human history, as far as I can think of.
Yeah.
So,
You can imagine, and this is kind of, where Revelations kind of goes.
Mm.
But when people look at the conflict that takes place between the Son of Man and the corruption that he's up against, when they look at it backwards, they'll see it almost in the same light, if not even in a greater degree, the way that we view the conflict between the Allies and the Axis in World War II. Mm-hmm. That the enemy was very clear cut. They were very clearly wrong. Mm-hmm. And yet somehow there's still an enemy that's caught up in it. And there's still got to be people who rise up to stand against it. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting how, redemptive history, you see these different conflicts played out between genuine evil, which we say, does evil exist, and why does evil exist, all those weird philosophical questions. But evil isn't a physical thing. It's something that we manifest. It's something that we do. It's a description. It's an adjective. It describes actions that are immoral, that are contrary to what's written into the fabric of the universe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and without evil, there is no free will.
Yeah.
I mean, if all that exists are good decisions or good moments, if you're about to walk in front of an oncoming car without you realizing it, and God, it's like, oh, okay, move that out of the way, or move you off to the side of the road so you don't get hit and survive. It's like, yes, it's a good thing, but that if you draw the line throughout the entire spectrum of humanity, that eliminates all free will. You're not, if you're only free to make good decisions, you're not free. Mm-hmm. If you're only free to make bad decisions, you're not free.
Yeah.
And there's no need for conviction. There's no need for guilt or shame or any other emotion. It's literally just, it's robotic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's what people fail to see sometimes. And I think I said this in the last podcast or one of the recent ones. When people ask about, or when people say, I don't believe in a God, I'm an atheist, or I don't believe in your God, and things like that. Well, ask them, describe to me what you don't believe. Because oftentimes they're thinking of the God they don't believe in is a God who only allows good things to happen. And that's not a God we believe in.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's a caricature.
Yeah. Well, we've got to wrap this up here. We've got maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes left. Any last quick points?
First of all, I'd say the way he was depicted was well done.
Yeah.
Considering I've even read some of his biography as well, and learned some of his life, and even just through history with World War II. And it is accurately depicted, including his contrariness.
His eating habits, his drinking habits.
Yeah.
Goodness. How do you drink so much?
Practice. That was a great line.
Yeah, exactly. So I love the way he
man.
depicted it. He did really well.
I really want to make a quick comment talking about sacrifice. I was also amazed by him, his wife, and his family.
Oh, yeah.
Because that scene, it says so much, where he's like talking about, how she says, when I married him, I knew I was going to come second. His life was going to be public life. And you can see how she's come to grips with that, but still it's a painful process, and how she's getting her picture done and she's alone. She's just hearing Winston off of the radio. And you see, it's ever so slight, the kids, as he said, it's like, and the kids have had to come to grips with that. Yeah. You see one shot of the sisters looking at him. You see a shot of the son just drinking, and how they essentially had grown up with a distant father. Mm-hmm. And there is something to be said about being a family, being there for your family, and then also what are you called to. So it's a difficult line, but it's something I feel like everyone needs to value. What is the cost of this? Because I want to be there for my family, and we all should be there for our families, but he definitely had this priority of, I'm called to serve this nation first. And I was amazed at his wife's character, that she's like, I am here for you, and I want people to love and respect you as I do. Mm-hmm. So I think that was some great character on her part as well, and his family.
Well, Glenn, it sounds like you're called to take care of a lot of the spiritual family, so appreciate that. I think we can all attest to the sermon you gave midway through there. Like you found the right passion. You found your passion. You're definitely called to that. So
that was good.
yeah, very much appreciate that. So thanks for coming on to the show, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you.
we'll be praying for you and hoping you can maybe come back before you head off to Germany.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. All right. So for Cinema Rabbit Trails, this is Jerry Andrew.
David Leffler.
Adam Rice.
And Glenda Tugan.
All right. See you guys next week.
See ya.